Lord Alton. David.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. With 97% of the world's communications transported via fibre optic submarine cables, with around 436 submarine cables in service worldwide spanning some 1.3 million kilometres, and some of them placed on the seabed or buried in the subsoil of areas claimed by multiple states. What are the issues that arise in that context, and how well does the law of the sea currently deal with those challenges?
Dr. Van Logchem.
Well, as was pointed out, if you look at international communication cables, these are of critical importance to maintaining international communications. Of course, they are, and I think that was mentioned in the previous session, they are, of course, susceptible to being damaged as a consequence of competing uses of the oceans, for example, anchoring. That is one issue. Another issue is that some of them are located in disputed maritime areas. Well, the issues here are slightly different compared to what I just mentioned around oil and gas resources. With regard to submarine cable activities, these activities are mostly undertaken by submarine cable companies, which are based in third states. So they're often not undertaken by states based in the claimant state itself. If we're talking about disputed EEZ or continental shelf areas, there is this question of, can a submarine cable company freely place a new submarine cable system? Because they do have, under the Law of the Sea Convention, the freedom to maintain, lay and repair submarine cables. I would argue that even if you have a disputed EEZ, a continental shelf area, the rights and freedoms of third states would still exist. These are still largely untouched, which also suggests that a third state, which, like I said, this is a bit of a legal fiction because, like I said, the activities in practice are actually exercised by the submarine cable companies, but the rights itself are given to a third state. But I was saying that in disputed areas, you still have those international rights and freedoms which are applicable in the EEZ as well. However, if you look at state practice, you do see that claimant coastal states sometimes use submarine cables as a vehicle to strengthen their claim to the disputed area in question. And they do that by way of adopting legislation, for example, that would be required to obtain a permit if you want to place a new submarine cable system within the disputed EEZ area, or for example, they would require repairing permits. And the main difficulty is thus that you have an accumulation of requirements to ask permits from different claimant states. And one of the criticism from the side of the submarine cable industry is that it makes their life much more difficult. They need to go through different processes with different coastal states. Some coastal states have quite complicated legislation on this point. They would require multiple permits from multiple departments. This translates to extra costs. It translates to delays. To give a more concrete example, after the Hengshun earthquake in, I think, 2004, a number of submarine cables were actually damaged, located within the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And then it took a very long time to actually repair that. And it was mainly because of the submarine cable company having to obtain permits from multiple claimant coastal states. Well, then you have the question of, well, would it be permissible for a submarine cable company to actually engage in these activities? I think it also depends on what is the activity in question. Because, for example, if there's a plan to develop a new submarine cable system, in general, submarine cable companies would try to avoid disputed maritime areas if they can. So their policy is very much based on if we can avoid a disputed maritime area, which would generate quite a number of difficulties for them. They, in the planning process, they do try to avoid that. But this is not always feasible because it may translate to adding thousands of extra submarine cables to your system. So from a financial point of view, it may not always be feasible to do that. If they do have to go through a disputed maritime area, then submarine cable companies will actually follow the rules and regulations of different states, because they want to avoid being targeted by one of the coastal states, for example, by it exercising its enforcement powers. So I think I already took up quite a bit of time. If you want me to elaborate further on this issue, I'm happy to, but I think I will stop here.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn to Lord Alton to see if you have a supplementary.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. If I can just press you further on the issue of the ownership of submarine cables. Should we be concerned that in recent years Chinese state-owned companies have greatly increased both their construction of subsea cables, for example, Huawei Marine, and ownership, for example, China Telecom and China Unicom, of undersea cables? In terms of resilience and national security, what can we learn from the US cable ship security program? Are we acting in unison with our Five Eyes partners in alliance, as we have done in telecommunications generally? Are we doing the same when it comes to submarine cables?
I must say that's a very difficult question to answer for me, because it does not seem to be very much a law of the sea related question. So I'm a bit hesitant to go into that issue. Of course, like I mentioned, there are questions around submarine cables generally, but if you look at the Law of the Sea Convention, it only addresses really the issues of placing cables, repairing cables, and maintaining them. It does not really address the issues that were just mentioned. So my hesitancy primarily comes from that this does not seem to be so much a law of the sea question. It's a very valid question, but I don't think I have a real sensible answer to that.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn to my colleague, Baroness Blackstone, next.